Okay, so let me now give you some stylistic advice that you may keep in mind as you sit down to write, especially the introduction, but also to some extent the method section as well. Number one, I would strongly encourage you to lose the jargon. What I mean by this is that I think sometimes students think that good writing is characterized by a very large number of very, very big words that most mortal humans can't understand, or a lot in the way of kind of psychobabble and things like that. And I would say that really the opposite is true. I would say that good writing is writing that is simple and straightforward and direct, that uses the simplest possible language to make the point that it's trying to make. And so really, you ought to be able to, in large part, give your paper to an educated, non-expert in this area of research, and they ought to be able to hang, pretty well in terms of understanding what you're actually trying to say. But you can only do that if you really kind of minimize the jargon that you use. I mean, I suppose some jargon is unavoidable. I mean, presumably, for instance, if in your paper you talk about the orienting reflex, let's say, and you continually make reference to the orienting reflex, I mean, I suppose you could say that's a piece of jargon or something that wouldn't be entirely familiar to a non-expert. But I suppose in that case you can minimize that concern by just making sure that you explain up front. Listen, here's what I mean when I talk about or when I use the term orienting reflex. But the bottom line, I think, though, is that you want to use simple language, direct, straightforward, that most people could understand, even if they didn't get an 800 on their SAT verbal. And this also says maybe lose the acronyms as well. Here's what I mean by this. One thing you could do in the writing of your paper is you could use all kinds of acronyms that would maybe make your life easier in some ways. So let's say for orienting reflex, if that term comes up in your introduction, and certainly it should, by the way. Let's say that for you say orienting reflex the first time, but then thereafter you say OR. And let's say that for skin conductance, again, you spell it out the first time, but then after that you say SC. And then maybe when you get to, talking about the picture categories, the first time you invoke them, you'll say, famous males, famous females, non-famous males, non-famous females. But then thereafter, you do things like, NF, FF, NFM. You get the idea. The point is that the more acronyms that you use, you're going to probably be well equipped to keep track of those and understand what they mean and things. But if you're asking a reader who's walking into this thing totally blind, not knowing what's going on, and you keep on referencing, let's say, a half dozen or a dozen acronyms, that's going to be really, really difficult for the reader to actually hang with that. And the reader's going to keep on going back to that first page or wherever you first invoked it, and they're going to say, okay, wait a minute, SC, what the heck was that? OR, what the heck was that? So if you can do it, you might consider just minimizing your use of acronyms. Not eliminating, maybe, but just think about I guess the cognitive toll that you're putting on your reader by asking him or her to keep track of all these acronyms. Number two, the literature review should be about ideas and not psychologists. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this. And in practical terms, what that means is that you may want to avoid starting sentences with the names of psychologists. That is to say, psychological researchers who produced, the research um, that's going to be reported or summarized in your introduction. So, an example of that sort would be if you look at the second paragraph here that says Roth and Hagar in 1986 reported that members of rock and roll bands tend to be lower in conscientiousness than school teachers. Now, this is not a horrible sin, a terrible sin, because you see this sort of thing quite a lot actually, where you'll see authors start sentences with the names of researchers who produced this research. But really, though, by doing this, what you're implying is that the sentence is fundamentally about Roth and Hagar. And by the way, that's a Van Halen reference. I doubt that any of you, or many of you, well, maybe some of you got it, I'm not sure. But the point is that the sentences shouldn't really be about Roth and Hagar. What it really should be about is about the idea that's encoded or embedded in that sentence. And so really then, if you think about that, the first way to do this, or the first approach would be a much better way of making the idea central. So this says members of rock and roll bands tend to be lower in conscientiousness than school teachers, and then Roth and Hagar, they're only important insofar as you're citing them to give them credit for the idea that you just summarized. So really, in the first approach, the idea is central. In the second approach, by saying Roth and Hagar reported, da da da, what you're saying is Roth and Hagar themselves are focal, and you probably shouldn't do that. So again, if I see this going on in your paper, I'm not gonna react, probably too severely, really, because like I said, you see that sort of thing quite a lot. But nevertheless, though, I think it's a good idea to try to minimize that strategy. For difficult topics, use lots and lots of examples. This is an especially useful thing to do, especially if you're in an area that the normal person in the street is not going to have a whole lot of knowledge of or, training in. So the more that you can do to invoke, really vivid examples, real life examples from the real world, the easier it's going to be for that person to actually understand. Okay, here's what this. I get what you're talking about now because it's because you've applied it to something that I'm actually familiar with. So please do feel free to use lots and lots of examples. I mentioned this before. This question asks, for whom should you write? And so you have lots of options, really. I mean, on the one hand, you could say that your target audience for your paper is, PhD level psychologists who do work in psychophysiology. And if that's the case, then you're free to use a lot of jargon, actually, to use all the jargon that you want, and to use all the fancy terms and things that you want. You may not even have to do a whole lot in the way of, like we talked about before, starting really broad with the introduction with something to engage interest and capture interest in things. Because for a person who's truly expert and knows a lot about this particular area, you may not have to do that, really, because they're already going to understand the importance of the work and what you're trying to do. But 99% of the people probably who are going to actually get their hands on your paper, I don't know, 99%, maybe that's a bit of an overstatement, but a very large number of people who actually are going to read your paper are not going to be, true experts in that area. And so my advice is really mirrors Bem's advice, which is what you should really think about doing is writing for an educated person, that is, a person who has, good solid reading skills, but that who has no special knowledge whatsoever of this particular research area. Okay, so that I think that's a good piece of advice. So you ought to be able to give this to, your parents, for instance. Your parents presumably don't know a whole lot about skin conductance and orienting and, and things like that, but they ought to be able to get their hands on your paper, and after reading the introduction, they ought to be able to say, okay, maybe this isn't the most interesting thing in the world to me, but nevertheless, I understand what you're saying. And as far as clarity goes, I think I've already touched on this, I think a little bit above, but what this says is effective writing is organized, and it's simple, and it's direct. As far as organized goes, I would very, very strongly encourage you to write an outline. I'm not sure if anyone does this or how many people actually do this, but this is so, so important for me. When I sit down to write an empirical paper, it's really important for me to figure out, before I even put a single word down on the page, uh, important for me to figure out what is the structure of this thing. In paragraph 1, what am I really trying to do here? And then in paragraph 2, paragraph 3. So you sort of map out the specific sections of the paper, so that when you sit down to write this thing, you already have a pretty good idea inside your head as to what you're trying to do. All you need to do is you need to fill in that skeleton, or fill in that outline with actual words. And so again, I would, if you don't do this, I would strongly encourage you to think about doing it, because it's a really, really nice way to organize your thinking. And if you organize your thinking really well, I think that the result is almost always just a paper that flows way, way better than it otherwise would. Effective writing is simple. I mentioned that, and again, this kind of is a bit of a review of where we've been before, but it's simple insofar as it doesn't use a lot of fancy language. It uses very direct language, simple, straightforward, that most people can understand. So you're not trying to. Your aim should not be to confuse people. Your aim should not be to write sentences that are so complicated and so lengthy that you could easily lose yourself in them. But write short sentences that are simple, that are direct. Use language that's simple and direct, and I think that's a nice way to go. And then finally, repetition and parallel construction. Let me give you an example to explain to you what I mean by this. And if you have questions about this, then you can refer to the Bem paper, because he talks about this, I think, in a pretty effective way in the chapter. But let me give you a couple of options here. Let's say that what he's doing here, and this is pulled right straight from his chapter. What he's trying to do is he's trying to set up the two experimental groups in a hypothetical study that a person could conduct. And he's trying to say, for group A, here's what's happening, here's what they're being exposed to, and in group B, here's what they're being exposed to. Okay, and you can consider two different approaches to doing this. The first one says the high dissonance participants were paid a small sum of money while being given a free choice of whether or not to participate, whereas the participants we randomly assigned to the large incentive treatment, in parentheses, the low dissonance condition, were not offered the opportunity to refuse. So, I don't know about you, but boy, I read that sentence and I say to myself, by the time I get to the end, I'm thinking, where the heck are we? What have I just read? You know, it's a really, really confusing. It's very kind of, well, first of all, it's very lengthy, and it's just not a very direct and straightforward way to kind of say things. In stark contrast to the second approach here, this says high dissonance participants were paid a small sum of money and were not required to participate. Low dissonance participants were paid a large sum of money and required to participate. So this is where the parallel construction piece comes in. Both of the clauses in this particular sentence are written in exactly the same way. You know, the only thing that you're doing is you're just describing, you know, again, for the high dissonance group, here's what it was. For the low dissonance group, here's what they were exposed to. But the overall structure of the sentence is really, or both clauses is the same in each case. And boy, that's just a lot simpler to read and to really understand compared to that first approach. So you should think about ways to maybe do that in your writing. And then finally, the question as to tense always comes up. Should I write this paper in the future tense, in the past tense, in the present tense? What should I do? Generally speaking, what you're going to do is you're going to be writing in the past tense. Okay, so what we assume then is that when a person sits down to write a paper, the research is already completed, the data have already been analyzed, and so on. And so since that's true, we're going to be writing in the past tense. It's occasionally the case, like in graduate school, for instance, students are required to do like proposals of research that they actually haven't done yet. In those cases, it's acceptable to use the future tense. In other words, what I'm going to do is X, Y, or Z. But when you sit down to write this thing, we're going to assume that the thing is already completed, the study is already completed, and then you're free to talk in the past tense as if it's already done, because in fact it is. I don't want to say a whole lot really about writing the method section right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a handout. And I'll do that on Tuesday. That will help you, I think, in a lot of ways to write the method section. But I do want to say just a couple of things in terms of best practices, in terms of a method section. First of all, what is the purpose? I guess, strictly speaking, the purpose of a method section is to lay out for any interested reader the actual methodology that you used. And we'll talk about what I mean by methodology. But it includes all these things that you see here listed under elements and a few more. So that the real purpose is that if you want to, or if that interested reader would want to replicate your work, by reading the method, by giving the method section a close, detailed sort of read, they ought to be able to have a pretty good idea as to what to do, how to set up that study in order to replicate your procedures, and then ultimately replicate, hopefully, your results. Now, in practical terms, it's not usually the case that you have every single, even the tiniest bits of information that you need to replicate. Sometimes maybe you get that, but oftentimes, you really don't. But overall, though, that's the idea. That's what we're trying to do. And so what that means is, or in practical terms, what that means is you're going to be describing the participants, how many were there, proportion of males to females, what was their age, ethnicity, how are they compensated, things like that. What were the materials? I'll note that in our study, you have a lot in the way of materials. I guess most notably what you have are the pictures. So you're going to want to do a lot to describe the pictures. Pictures of what? Where did you get them? Things like that. The apparatus. Now, I'm not going to expect you guys to know a whole lot about how to describe the apparatus, and so that's why I prepared this little sheet that you see here on the screen, so that you can sort of just pull some of the language in terms of describing the apparatus and insert that into your paper. The procedure. What that basically means is start to finish. What exactly were the researchers, what were the participants exposed to? So in other words, step number one, they came in, they completed informed consent. We asked them to wash their hands. Second, attach the sensors. That was third. Deliver the instructional script. That was fourth. And so basically, it's just boom, boom, boom. Number one all the way down to number 12. What exactly were they exposed to? and I'm running out of time here. But data reduction, that just basically means we have these physiological signals that we're going to be collecting in the study. How do we turn those signals from, in terms of from qualitative waveforms that appear on a screen to actual numbers, that is, quantitative numbers that are suitable and that we can subject to statistical analysis, and then finally the analytic approach as well. So that's it. I'm open to your questions. Hope this was helpful.